In December 1942, tens of thousands of German soldiers believed Christmas would mark the beginning of their rescue. Surrounded, freezing, and starving, they waited for the sky to deliver food, fuel, or salvation. What actually arrived marked the point of no return in the war. In the middle of one of the harshest winters of the century, a ruined city became more than a battlefield. There, decisions made far from the front lines began to matter more than tanks, aircraft, or manpower. With every passing day, survival became less a military challenge and more a sentence already written. The encirclement tightened. The cold killed silently. Hunger broke bodies before minds. And still, many believed the worst was over. That Christmas would bring a turning point. That help was coming. But how did an entire army fall into this trap? Why did the promise of rescue never materialize? And at what moment did Christmas stop being a symbol of hope and become the confirmation of defeat? To understand that, we need to go back a few months to the moment confidence turned into arrogance and the German advance marched straight into hell. In 1942, Stalingrad was not just another objective on the Eastern Front. It was a strategic artery and a symbolic prize. Sitting on the Volga River, the city controlled vital transport routes that fed Soviet industry and military logistics. Capturing it would sever north-south traffic, protect Germany's southern advance toward the Caucasus oil fields, and strike directly at a city bearing Stalin's name. For German leadership, Stalingrad represented both military necessity and ideological triumph. The summer offensive of 1942 unfolded with alarming confidence. After months of success, German forces surged deep into southern Soviet territory. Entire Soviet units collapsed or retreated, reinforcing the belief that the Red Army was nearing exhaustion. This momentum bred overconfidence. Supply lines stretched across vast distances, flanks were thinly held by Allied units, and the possibility of a major Soviet counteroffensive was dismissed. The campaign was driven forward by momentum, not caution. By late summer, German troops were fighting inside Stalingrad itself. The battle turned into a grinding urban nightmare, with factories, apartment blocks, and ruins changing hands repeatedly. But while German attention focused on capturing every street and building, Soviet planners were preparing something far larger. They had identified the weakness, the overstretched flanks guarding the German advance. In November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. Instead of attacking the city head-on, Soviet forces struck the weaker Romanian and German units north and south of Stalingrad. The breakthrough was rapid and devastating. Within days, Soviet pincers met west of the city, encircling the entire German Sixth Army along with Allied formations. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers were trapped inside what would soon be called the Stalingrad Pocket. At this moment, the disaster was not yet inevitable. A breakout or withdrawal could still have saved much of the force. Field commanders recognized this. But Adolf Hitler issued a direct order: no retreat. Stalingrad was to be held at all costs. The city became a symbol that could not be abandoned, regardless of reality on the ground. A tactical defeat was transformed into a strategic catastrophe, frozen in place by ideology, pride, and refusal to adapt. Surrounded and cut off, the German soldiers still believed survival was possible. After all, Hitler promised something that would defy the encirclement itself: a massive airlift. But what actually came from the sky would seal their fate. Once the Soviet encirclement closed around Stalingrad, the survival of the German Sixth Army depended on a single fragile promise: supply by air. Hitler and the High Command assured the trapped forces that the Luftwaffe would deliver everything needed to keep them fighting. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, all would arrive from the sky. On paper, the plan appeared bold but achievable. In reality, it was a fatal illusion. Military calculations were clear. To sustain the encircled army at a minimum operational level, at least 300 tons of supplies per day were required. Some estimates placed the real number closer to 500. The Luftwaffe, however, lacked both the aircraft and the infrastructure to meet even the lower figure. Transport planes were already overstretched across multiple fronts, crews were exhausted, and maintenance resources were limited. Even under perfect conditions, the airlift would have struggled. Conditions, however, were anything but perfect. Winter arrived early and brutally. Snowstorms grounded flights. Temperatures froze engines, fuel lines, and runways. Airfields inside the pocket were primitive, damaged, and constantly under Soviet artillery fire. Pilots flew long distances at low altitude, making them easy targets for Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Losses mounted rapidly. Planes that did land often had to unload under fire, sometimes taking off again with wounded soldiers instead of supplies. Every flight was a gamble. German leadership attempted to justify the plan by pointing to a previous success, the Demainsk pocket earlier in the war. There, an airlift had sustained encircled German troops for months. But the comparison was deeply flawed. Stalingrad was farther from supply bases, the number of soldiers trapped was vastly larger, and Soviet air power was significantly stronger. The scale alone made the operation impossible. What had worked in one context could not be repeated here. The mathematics simply did not add up. As days passed, the consequences became undeniable. Deliveries rarely exceeded a fraction of what was needed. Some days, almost nothing arrived. Rations were cut repeatedly. Fuel disappeared, immobilizing vehicles and artillery. Medical supplies ran out, turning wounds and illnesses into death sentences. The airlift did not sustain the army, it slowly starved it, one failed delivery at a time. When the airlift collapsed under its own weight, an even more merciless enemy took control. It was no longer just the Red Army tightening the noose, it was winter itself. And Christmas was drawing closer. By mid-December 1942, life inside the Stalingrad pocket had collapsed into a daily struggle against extinction. The failure of the airlift meant that hunger was no longer a looming threat. It was the defining condition of existence. Official rations shrank to a fraction of what a human body needed to function. Bread portions were cut again and again, sometimes replaced with horse meat, sometimes with nothing at all. Men grew weaker by the day, their bodies consuming themselves just to stay alive. Starvation was no longer an abstraction. It was visible in sunken faces, trembling hands, and the inability to stand without effort. Cold completed what hunger began. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and there was almost no fuel left for heating. Uniforms were worn thin, boots were falling apart, and frostbite spread relentlessly. Fingers blackened, toes went numb, and limbs became useless. Medical units, already overwhelmed, lacked bandages, medicine, and even shelter. Many soldiers were left untreated, not because no one cared, but because there was nothing left to give. Death often came at night, quietly, when exhausted bodies could no longer generate enough heat to survive until morning. Shelter offered little protection. Bunkers and cellars were overcrowded, carved hastily into rubble or frozen earth. Men slept pressed together, sharing body heat in a desperate attempt to stay alive. The air inside these spaces was thick with smoke, sweat, and despair. Lice spread rapidly. Disease followed. In these conditions, even rest became dangerous. Falling asleep too deeply could mean never waking up. And yet, as Christmas approached, fragments of normality surfaced. Not because conditions improved, but because the human mind clings to meaning when everything else is stripped away. Some soldiers whispered carols they barely remembered. Others spoke of home, of families, of Christmases that now felt like memories from another lifetime. A candle stub, a shared piece of bread, a quiet moment of silence. These gestures did not restore hope, but they preserved identity. They reminded men that they were still human, not just expendable figures inside a collapsing army. One image, in particular, spread through the pocket with quiet power, the Madonna of Stalingrad. Drawn by German Dr. Kurt Reuber on the back of a map, it depicted a mother holding a child, wrapped in sheltering arms. The drawing passed from bunker to bunker, pinned to walls, studied in silence. It did not promise rescue or victory. Instead, it offered something far rarer at that moment: psychological refuge. A symbol of protection in a place where nothing protected you. Even in these conditions, many still believed the worst was over, that the airlift might recover, that a relief force was on its way. But on Christmas itself, that final belief would be shattered, and with it, the last illusion of survival. For the soldiers trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket, Christmas was tied to one last expectation: rescue. That hope had a name: Operation Winterstorm. In mid-December 1942, German relief forces launched an offensive from the south, aiming to break through Soviet lines and reopen a land corridor to the encircled Sixth Army. Inside Stalingrad, rumors spread quickly. Distant artillery fire was sometimes heard, faint but unmistakable. For men who had been cut off for weeks, those sounds felt like proof that salvation was approaching. But the reality was far harsher. The relief force faced massive Soviet resistance and lacked the strength to punch through. Soviet counterattacks stopped the advance short of its objective. The distance between the rescuers and the encircled army remained insurmountable. Crucially, Hitler once again forbade a breakout attempt from inside Stalingrad. Even if the relief force had come closer, the trapped soldiers were ordered to stay where they were. Strategy was sacrificed to symbolism. By December 23rd and 24th, the truth became unavoidable. The artillery sounds faded. Radio messages changed tone. The airlift did not improve. No new supplies arrived. Christmas Eve passed not with announcements of relief, but with silence. Inside the bunkers, men understood what that silence meant. Winter storm had failed. There would be no rescue. This realization spread quietly, without panic. There was no energy left for that. Instead, a heavy calm settled over the pocket. Christmas ceased to be a date associated with warmth or faith. It became a marker, the moment when illusion finally collapsed. From this point forward, survival was no longer a collective expectation, but an individual question. Each man measured his chances not in days or weeks, but in hours. The psychological shift was devastating. Orders were still given, positions still held, but the belief underlying all military action was gone. Soldiers were no longer fighting for victory, or even for relief. They were fighting because stopping felt like surrendering to death itself. Christmas confirmed what weeks of hunger and cold had already suggested. They had been abandoned, not accidentally, but deliberately. After Christmas, the question inside Stalingrad was no longer if the army would collapse, but how long the men inside could endure before it did. And the end was approaching faster than anyone wanted to admit. In January 1943, the collapse of the German Sixth Army entered its final phase. Soviet forces tightened their grip, crushing resistance sector by sector. Starving, frozen, and exhausted, entire units ceased to function as coherent formations. Weapons were abandoned not out of choice, but because there was no strength left to carry them. By the end of the month, the southern pocket surrendered. In early February, the last remnants in the north followed. Stalingrad was over. The scale of the defeat was unprecedented. Approximately 91,000 German and Axis soldiers were taken prisoner, including senior officers who had once believed surrender was unthinkable. But captivity offered no safety. Years of imprisonment, forced labor, malnutrition, and disease followed. Of those captured, only an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 would ever return home. For the rest, Stalingrad remained a death sentence that extended long beyond the battlefield. Militarily, the consequences were immediate and irreversible. The entire German southern front was destabilized. More importantly, the myth of German invincibility, carefully constructed through years of victories and propaganda, was shattered. For the first time, a complete German field army had been destroyed. Both allies and enemies understood what this meant. The momentum of the war had shifted permanently. Psychologically, Stalingrad echoed far beyond the ruins of the city. In Germany, the defeat could not be hidden, only delayed. When the truth emerged, it marked a turning point in public perception. The war was no longer a distant struggle fought by others. It was a conflict that could be lost, and disastrously so. Stalingrad became more than a battle. It became a symbol of strategic arrogance, ideological rigidity, and the human cost of refusing to retreat. The Christmas of 1942 stood at the center of that symbol, not as a moment of peace, but as the instant when defeat became unavoidable. Long before the surrender documents were signed, the war had already been lost there. The Christmas of 1942 in Stalingrad was not just the darkest Christmas in German history. It was the moment the war turned, the day Germany lost everything it could no longer afford to lose.